Good afternoon, everybody. It's a very interesting little bout of research that I have gone down lately. So I was looking for a very concise summary of, all of the different arguments for the existence of God. And I found that they generally tend to be grouped into a couple of main categories. Now, firstly, the one that I'm going to be covering today, excuse me, is the teleological group of arguments, which, in my opinion, is probably the strongest arguments, for the existence of God, weak as that may seem. But I've prepared a little bit. It's not going to take me long to read through this either. I'm going to be quoting a lot of this from a professor of philosophy at King's College in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania. So this gentleman's name is David Carl Johnson, and I think he did an excellent job of looking at the teleological argument in all its different facets, and systematically addressing every single aspect thereof. So without further ado, let me jump straight into it. So basically, the teleological argument is traditionally an a posteriori argument for the existence of God. So a posteriori in Latin means from the latter. So it's a term from logic, which basically refers to reasoning that works backwards from an effect to its causes. Perhaps the most famous variant of this argument is the William Paley's watchmaker argument, which I'm sure all of you are familiar with. William Paley was an English clergyman, a Christian apologist, philosopher, and utilitarian. So he's best known for his Natural Theology exposition of the teleological argument for the existence of God in his work, Natural Theology, or Evidence of the Existence and Attributes of the Deity, which made use of the watchmaker's analogy. So basically, this argument says that after seeing a watch with all its intricate parts which work together in a precise fashion to keep time, one must deduce that this piece of machinery has a creator, since it is far too complex to have simply come into being by some other means, such as evolution. The skeleton of the argument basically has four premises. The first premise is human artifacts are products of intelligent design. They have a purpose. The second premise is the universe resembles these artifacts. The third premise, therefore, it is probable that the universe is a product of intelligent design and has a purpose. The fourth premise, however, the universe is vastly more complex and gigantic than a human artifact is. And then the conclusion follows: there is probably a powerful and vastly intelligent designer who created the universe. So, Paley also found some justification in scripture for his argument. Who'd have thunk it? So the verse that he quotes is Romans 1, verse 19 to 20. It's the one that all the pre-suppers use. You guys know it as well, I'm sure, which goes, for what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them ever since the creation of the world. His invisible nature, namely his eternal power and deity, has been clearly perceived in the things that have been made, so they are without excuse. So the teleological argument and fine-tuning go hand in hand. You'll very seldom hear the one without the other. The teleological argument, it sounds intimidating, but it's actually just the argument from goals in logic, or as it's known today, the argument from design. And it's probably the most academically cited argument for God's existence. but the argument is also directly related to questions about the nature of the universe and why it is the way that it is. So just like the cosmological argument, you should keep in mind such questions as we consider the teleological argument as well. The teleological argument is arguably the most famous argument for God's existence, since a version of it supposedly convinced the philosopher Anthony Flew, who was one of the most famous atheists of all time, to believe in God. Although this probably sounds impressive, it is unclear whether it actually is. First, if Flew converted at all, it was only to deism. A deist is someone who thinks God created and designed the universe, but then just forgot about it. Such a God is like a watchmaker who winds up the universe like a watch and then lets it run without any concern for how it turns out. Obviously, Flew converted to deism. He is not a traditional theist and certainly not a Christian. His conversion also happened when Flew was older and thus had weaker mental capacities. Many thus wonder whether his conversion should be considered genuine. Some people think those who presented the argument to Flew hornswoggled him a bit, saying that things aren't scientifically accurate to make the argument seem better than it is. After all, they did ghostwrite the subsequent book, There Is a God, How the World's Most Notorious Atheist Changed His Mind. Others claim that Flew never converted in the first place or retracted his conversion later. Still others suggest that subsequent statements made by Flew contradict these points and that he was really convinced. But whether he was really convinced by the argument is not really our concern here. We are concerned about whether any version of the argument is actually any good. Are the premises true? Do its premises really support the conclusion? Right, so let's jump into Paley's watch argument. Although Thomas Aquinas, probably the most recognized of the Catholic medieval philosophers, put forth an earlier version of the design argument as his fifth way to prove God's existence, the most famous design argument belongs to the 18th century philosopher William Paley. He points out that if you stumbled upon a stone, you would not likely conclude that the stone had a designer. But if you had stumbled upon a watch, you would certainly conclude that it had an intelligent designer because it clearly has parts that were placed with a purpose. Paley argues that in the same way, biological things like you and me are parts placed for a purpose. For example, our eyes seem to clearly have been placed with the purpose of processing visual information. Thus, we must have a designer. At any rate, although it was probably thought to be a good argument, given what people knew at the time, Paley's argument can no longer be considered a good argument. Put simply, the theory of evolution, one of the most well-established theories in all of science, shows that Paley was wrong. Why? Because it shows how living organisms can have parts that have particular functions without those organisms being designed. Roughly put, we all have the functional traits we do, like a functioning eye, not because some designer gave them to us for the purpose of seeing, but because past random mutations gave our ancestors those traits, and those traits were advantageous for the survival and reproduction of the species. It is probably important to note that evolution is not incompatible with theistic or Christian beliefs. That Paley's argument fails to establish God's existence doesn't mean that God doesn't exist, as we discussed before. A bad argument to a conclusion doesn't mean that the conclusion is false. In addition, although evolution is incompatible with a literal interpretation of Genesis 1 and 2, one need not embrace such an interpretation to be religious or even be a Christian, any more than one must be a terrorist to be a Muslim. Most religions and religious organizations in the world are openly accepting the theory of evolution, just like most Muslims oppose terrorism. So Paley's failure also teaches us that it's dangerous to justify your belief in something by using that thing as an explanation for a currently unexplained thing. Why? Because science is so good at explaining things. A large portion of what was previously unexplained or even seemed inexplicable is now explained by science. And although it is questionable as to whether we will explain everything or any given thing that is now unexplained, it is likely that it will be explained one day. So if your reasons for believing in something are tethered to something that is currently unexplained, the chances are your reasons for belief will eventually be pulled out from under you. So the next thing he addresses is this fine-tuning of the earth idea, which is completely absurd. I mean, he so clearly lays this out. So let me give this to you as it goes. So the fact that evolution so soundly defeated Paley's argument gave rise to another kind of design argument, the argument from fine-tuning. The first such argument points out that there seems to be this fine-tuning of the earth for evolution to occur. So yes, we do not need to hypothesize the existence of a designer to explain our biological parts. Evolution can do that, but we need an explanation for why evolution could occur on the earth to begin with. It seems that the conditions on earth are just right for evolution to occur, so fine-tuned that it seems that somebody intended for life to evolve. How so? We are just the right distance from the sun, not too hot, not too cold. We have an abundance of water and a single large moon that steadies our tides and our climate. We have an atmosphere that contains air for us to breathe and provides protection from meteors. The star we orbit and our orbit around it is stable, as is our planet's rotation. We even have a magnetic field that is emitted from the iron core of our planet that defends us against solar radiation. But like the cosmological argument, as an argument that points specifically to the traditional perfect tri-omni-God of theism, this argument falls short. A being who has fine-tuned the earth for evolution would need to be more powerful, but not necessarily perfect or all-powerful. Nevertheless, the argument suggests some kind of deity must be responsible for earth meeting all of these conditions. The main problem with this argument is that it mistakes the odds. It suggests that such fine-tuning is improbable when it actually is not. Consider, for example, what are your chances of winning the lottery? When you stop to think about it, you realize that this question is actually a very bad question. It's ambiguous. It depends on what the word somebody means. What are the chances that a particular person would win the lottery? Very low. But what are the chances that at least one person would win the lottery? It is a near guarantee. And even though for any particular person, the likelihood that they will win is low, when some particular person does win, we need not invoke a designer to explain why they did. What are the chances that some planet would have all the condition it needs for evolution to occur? Well, that depends on what you mean by some planet. What are the chances that some particular planet could have the right conditions? Very low. But what are the chances that some planet somewhere in the universe will have all the right conditions? Given the size of the universe, it's a near guarantee. There are billions upon billions of galaxies, all with billions of stars and planets orbiting them. Therefore, the chance that some planet orbiting one of those stars would have everything it needs for evolution to occur, and that is a practical guarantee. Some planet was going to win the lottery, and so, although the odds that this particular planet would have the right conditions for life is low, that life evolved on this planet does not need an explanation any more than somebody winning the lottery needs an explanation. In fact, the more we explore the galaxy, the more common it seems that planets are. So the existence of any life conductive planets just in our own galaxy may be a near guarantee. Which brings us to the next argument, the fine-tuning argument. So the fact that there are many planets, each with a chance of having the right conditions for life to evolve, means that we need not invoke a designer to explain why our planet has the right conditions for life. But isn't there just one universe? And aren't the laws of the universe set up in such a way to guarantee that life evolves? If so, might we need to invoke a designer to explain why our universe is fine-tuned for life? Indeed, we might, and that is the basis for the fine-tuning argument that philosophers and scientists are most concerned with today. The argument goes something like this. Almost everything about the basic structure of the universe, its laws and its initial state, seems balanced on a razor edge for life to evolve. That is, the universe seems fine-tuned for life. Why? Because if any one of those forces or constants was slightly different than it is, then life could not evolve. And it seems that this kind of fine-tuning is much more probable on theism than atheism. Sure, it is possible that the universe could just so happen to be fine-tuned without the work of an intelligent force, but it seems unlikely. Whereas the universe being fine-tuned, that is exactly what you would expect if it were created and designed by some kind of a benevolent God. It is as if the dials that determine what the laws and the constant that govern the universe have been set by someone in the one and only position that they would have been had to be set in order for life to evolve. And I very fondly remember somebody once saying that God was the invisible knob twiddler. And to the English, there is definitely a double entendre there in the English language. So I digress. Let me continue. So what are these laws and constants that are balanced on a razor's edge? How exactly are the dials fine-tuned? The number of supposed fine-tuned factors is long. So let me just mention a few of the important ones usually espoused by those who defend the fine-tuning argument. It seems that the strong nuclear force, which holds together the nucleus of an atom, were it any weaker or stronger to the slightest degree, then atoms would collapse or fly apart. Too much and all of the proton gets pulled into its nucleus. Too little and all of the protons fly off into oblivion. It seems that if the weak nuclear force, which makes possible radioactive decay, was stronger or weaker to the slightest degree, there would be either too many or too few heavy elements. So if gravity had a slightly different strength than it does, stars would either be too weak or too cool to support the evolution of life. If electromagnetism was slightly different, or if the ratio of the electron to the proton mass was slightly different, it seems that chemical bonding wouldn't allow for the evolution of life, and the ratio of electromagnetism to gravity was slightly different, then stars would either be too big or too small. A slightly different ratio of electrons to protons in the universe could seem to prevent galaxy, star, and planet formation. According to Stephen Hawking, if the electric charge of the electron had only been slightly different, stars either would have been unable to burn hydrogen and helium, or else they would not have exploded. And if the rate of the expansion of the universe were different, it could either collapse back in on itself or expand way too quickly to form galaxies. So the fine-tuning argument sounds impressive, and some even think it is conclusive. However, there are actually a number of very serious problems with the argument. So the initial problems with the fine-tuning argument, first of all, even if the universe is fine-tuned, it is not clear that the purpose of this fine-tuning is the evolution of life. Given the relative scarcity of life that exists in the universe, even given our most liberal estimates, life does not exist in very many places and not for very long. It seems that what the universe is actually fine-tuned for is galaxy formation. That is the main thing that the universe does and wants to do, is produce galaxies. Life is just an unintended consequence of galaxy formation. To suggest that the universe is fine-tuned for the creation of life is a bit like saying that your toaster is fine-tuned to fill the crumb catcher at its base. That is something that it does, but it is not its main purpose. So even if the universe is fine-tuned, it does not point to the existence of a traditional theistic God or even a non-traditional one. Secondly, the argument seems to invalidate itself. If the complexity of the universe demands a fine-tuner, then the creator of that universe would demand a fine-tuner as well. In fact, it would demand a fine-tuner even more than the universe itself, because designers are more complicated than the things they design. But then the designer of that designer would require a further fine-tuner, and the circle continues ad infinitum. So either you would have an infinite regress of fine-tuners or knob twiddlers, each fine-tuning the next, or somewhere along the line you would have to end that regress with something that itself needs fine-tuning but does not have it. Something's complex design is just going to have to be a brute fact. But if you are committed to something's design being a brute fact, it is just simpler to say that the universe design is a brute fact and leave it at that. There's no need to interject one or more new thing to be its designer if you're just going to admit that the new thing itself needs to be designed as well, but actually isn't designed. Thirdly, there seems to be no good reason to suppose that the values that our fine-tuning argument mentions could be any different than they actually are. The fine-tuning argument suggests that the universe must be fine-tuned, because if any of the laws or constraints had a different value, then the universe would simply not support life. But that assumes that the values could be different. Yet there is no argument presented for why they could be different than they are. Of course, one can imagine them having different values than they do. For example, one can present the current values that they have with numbers and then simply imagine different numbers. But that doesn't mean that it's actually possible for the laws and the constants in question to have different values. The constants and ratios that the fine-tuning argument mentions could be what they are necessarily. That we can imagine them being different doesn't mean that they actually could be different. And if they can't be different, then they don't need an explanation for why they aren't different. Additionally, the motivation for this version of the fine-tuning argument started with the assumption that there is only one universe. And if the universe only had one chance to get it right, then the chances that it got it right are very low. So this follows only if there is only one universe. Yet we are now discovering that there are reasons to think that there are multiple universes, and multiple successions of universes coming into existing and then fizzling out. It is possible, for example, that there are different universes that exist on different dimensional planes, or it could be that the universe itself is perpetually oscillating. It explodes from a big bang, it expands, and then it collapses back on itself all the way down to a singularity, and then it re-explodes. That is not the prevailing theory, but it is possible. What is the accepted theory today is that the universe is continually expanding at an exponential rate, so quickly that it will eventually reach what is called a heat death, where all the particles of the universe will be completely expanded apart and it reaches a vacuum state. As we saw when we talked about the cosmological argument, this is probably from a previous chapter, matter can be created spontaneously in pure vacuums, and the universe itself may have originated from a fluctuation in the giant vacuum, which is the quantum foam. If the universe expands into nothingness, we can again be back to the pure quantum foam and conditions conducive to the creation of another universe. And that universe could expand out again and again into a pure vacuum, which could create another universe. I just want to say at this stage, like, my mind is blown. It's like, like that people can, hypothesize these kind of things. I mean, who would, let me just continue. And as you will later see in the some interpretations of what we observe in quantum mechanics suggest that the existence of multiple universes as well. So regardless of the reason, if there are multiple universes, it is not likely, or unlikely, I should say, that one should have laws that are conducive to the evolution of life, especially if every universe's laws are set at random. Some universe could win the laws for life lottery. So the universe is not fine-tuned. But what I find to be the most fascinating objection to fine-tuning argument is this. Fine-tuning is not actually improbable. There are actual number of reasons for thinking this, but let's consider each in turn. So first of all, to make it seem improbable that the values in question have the value that they do, the fine-tuning argument assigns an equal probability to all possible causes that they could have. Yet as with most things, it is not how it really works. All values are not equally probable. Consider an example. So he borrowed this from the contemporary philosopher Neil A. Manson, where Tiger Woods takes a chip shot towards the pin. What is the probability that the ball will land within 6 feet from the pin? The probability is very high. And notice that the probability is very high, even though there are a large number of factors that have to be just right in order for this to happen. If any of those factors took one of the thousands of other values that they could have been, the ball would not be anywhere close to the pin. Think of all the other places the ball could land, yet it seems very likely that the ball will land at least 6 feet from the pin. Why is this? Because Tiger Woods' skill gives a certain probabilistic bias to certain values that those factors could have. They make it more likely that his club will have a certain range of pitches, powers, and trajectories. Now, you might think this is a bad example since Tiger Woods is an agent, a being that gives a certain bias to these values. He fine-tunes his swing. And the fine-tuning argument is suggesting that God is an agent that gives a certain bias to the values of the universe. But the point is that most probabilities have a bias, regardless of whether that bias is explained by a person or natural conditions. So unless there is evidence that no such bias exists for the factors that govern the laws and constants of the universe, we can't assign an equal probability to all values, which the argument actually does. So secondly, the fine-tuning argument exploits misleading units of measurement to make the fine-tuning seem more amazing than it is. Consider another example, again borrowing from Manson. Michael Jordan. What are the chances that Michael Jordan would be the right height to play basketball? Well, if Jordan's height differed by just 1/10 to the 16th of a light year, he would not be able to play basketball. He would either be too tall, a lumbering giant, or too short, a little person. So his height must be fine-tuned, right? No. 1 times 10 to the 16th of a light year is a whole meter. It's not likely at all that Jordan would have been a whole meter taller or shorter than he is. But by expressing the different probabilities of his height in terms of light years, an extremely unproportional method of measurement, I have made the fact that Michael Jordan has the height to play basketball seem more amazing than it actually is. The fine-tuning argument does the same thing with all of the values it mentions. For example, it told us that if the mass of neutrinos were 5 times 10 to the 34th kilograms instead of 5 times 10 to the 35th kilograms, the universe would contract rather than expand. But neutrinos are super tiny particles. And the fine-tuning argument is expressing their weight in kilograms, the same unit of measurement used to express the weight of human beings. This fact seems much less amazing if you put it this way. Neutrinos could still have a mass 10 times greater than they do, and we would still have an expanding universe. This actually expresses the same fact, and it is obviously shows that the weight of the neutrino is not nearly as fine-tuned as it seems to be when expressed in kilograms. So meaningless or worthless. Another objection found in the fact that the values of the probabilities of the conclusion of the fine-tuning argument are either meaningless or worthless. Why? Well, you can only make sense of probabilities if you are working with finite amounts. 1 in infinity is a meaningless probability. Suppose I tell you to guess the number I am thinking of, and that it could be literally any number. There are infinitely many. So what are the chances that the number I am thinking of is between 0 and 10? It's 1 in an infinity, because there's an infinite number of numbers outside of that set. But what are the chances that it would fall between 0 and 1 billion? again, 1 in an infinity, because there is an infinite amount of numbers that fall outside of that set. So 1 in infinity is a meaningless probability, but there are an infinite number of values that the parameters of the universe could have, granting that they could have different values because you can represent their values in numbers, and there is an infinite set of numbers. So to figure a meaningful probability rather than regarding fine-tuning, you'd have to select some infinite set of values and lay down probabilities based on the size of that set. You would have to say that, for example, the value of some particular property could have its value between 1 and 100, and so the chances that it would have the right value are 1 in 100. Now, I just chose a range between 1 and 100 arbitrarily, but that is the point. The size of the set that you would select to figure the probabilities could only be selected arbitrarily, and how likely the needed value ends up being depends solely on the size of the set that you select. If you select a small set, the likelihood would really be high, and if you choose a big set, the probability would be really low. So whether or not fine-tuning is improbable depends solely upon one's arbitrary choice, and if so, anybody could choose anything that they like and make a fine-tuning argument of the universe as likely or as unlikely as they want, but any such pronouncement would be completely worthless. So the claims made about probabilities by fine-tuning arguments are either meaningless or worthless. And this is like the one section of this this chapter that I really struggled with, because I suck at math. I'm really terrible at math. Beyond addition, multiplication, and basic trigonometry, I'm useless at it, but it makes sense, like when you think in terms of probabilities, we don't really, we're not naturally geared to understand probabilities. It takes a bit for you to figure out what the chances really are of something happening. And even when somebody says to you, there's a 1 in 10 or a 4 in 20 chance, you have to really think about, what that actually means in terms of a value judgment. And that is why the ambiguity of probability is a fair breeding ground for creationists, especially to, to come and plug God into the socket there. So another point that he brings up here is there only one way to make a universe? So this is the last objection to the fine-tuning argument. And it actually exposes a fallacy committed by the argument. I call it the only way to make a square fallacy. Recall the reasoning of the fine-tuning argument is this: if one of the many laws, constants, or values that govern how the universe were different, then life would not evolve. From this, they concluded that there is not only one set of values for those laws, constants, but that the universe also, for the universe to be compatible for life, and so they reason that the likelihood of that particular one set of values is low. But consider this exactly parallel line of reasoning. I'm walking along and I find a square consisting of lines that are exactly 1 centimeter in length. I rightly observe that if one of the sides of the square was slightly shorter, then the figure would no longer be a square. But I then conclude from this that the only way to make a square is with lines that are exactly 1 centimeter in length. So obviously this argument is fallacious. Yes, changing the one side would make the figure, cease to be a square. But if multiple sides change in proportion to each other, then it would still be a square. So in fact, there are an infinite number of ways to construct a square. And in the same way, changing only one constant might make the universe uninhabitable. This is true. But changing more than one constant might compensate for the changes of the others and make it still habitable. So it simply doesn't follow from the fact that changing one value would make the universe uninhabitable, that the values of the universe has are only the one that is conducive to life. So the conclusion of a fine-tuning argument simply doesn't follow from its premises. And what's more is that the physicist Victor Stenger has shown that instead of just imagining one change, if you allow for changes in all of the governing factors and allow them to be set randomly, you get a universe conducive to life about 50% of the time. So there actually is more than one way to set the dials and get a universe conducive to life. And getting one fine-tuned for life is not unlikely at all. Even more astonishing is that many of these supposedly fine-tuned values are intrinsically linked. Changing one necessarily and automatically changes the other and keeps them in balance such that galaxies, stars, and life are possible. This is a result of conservation, which is an intrinsic property of space-time itself, and thus demands no explanation. For example, the conservation of energy necessitates that the universe's expansion rate and its mass density are what they are. They literally can't be any different than they are. The mass of neutrinos is also dictated by their number. If there were more neutrinos, then they would all be lighter, and if there were fewer, then they would all be heavier. There can't be too many of them, and they can't be too heavy. So, like you asked me, how does this tie into God? So the conclusion here, I know it's been a bit of a long one, so please bear with me. It's going to be over in about a few minutes. So once again, the failure of the fine-tuning argument doesn't mean that God doesn't exist. A bad argument to a conclusion does not mean that the conclusion is false. It just means that the fine-tuning argument does not demonstrate God's existence. If you want to demonstrate God's existence, you're going to have to rely on another argument or simply take it on faith. Given the failure of the other arguments we have considered, it's also probably unlikely that you're going to find another argument, so you're likely going to have to take it on faith. Now, whether faith is acceptable, it's often said to be a virtue. That's another matter completely, but it's not an epistemological matter. It's not a metaphysical one. So we will have to say that it's a topic for another conversation, not this particular one. But the arguments that we have just considered, especially by the teleological arguments, have brought up very interesting metaphysical questions as well. Questions about the very nature of the universe. Why does it exist? And why is it the way that it is? And ultimately, the best answers may simply appeal to brute facts. The universe just is, and it just is the way that it is. I found this article extremely stimulating to read, and I thought I'd share it with you guys. We are continuing our search for new atheists to introduce to you guys. It's just been over the holiday period. People have been quite reluctant to come on, but fear not, I am not relenting in my quest to expose you to African and female atheists of all walks of life. We shall continue to do that in 2023 and bring you lots of interesting content to view and to build our community from that. I wish you well. Enjoy the rest of your Sunday afternoon, and we will check in next week.